This is Tim O'Brien reporting from Seattle on October 27th, 2025. This morning I'm going to talk about a GenAI article I wrote last night about legal issues that developers tend to ignore. But first, let's cover the news. On Hacker News, the top vote getter is a story about a cross-platform Rust UI component library. It's using something called GPUI. This is a Rust-based UI framework from the creators of the Zed code editor, and it provides a comprehensive set of cross-platform GUI components. It looks pretty compelling and allows you to create desktop applications that have smooth performance across multiple platforms and gives a consistent look and feel. It's very interesting. It's got a lot of activity. The GitHub repository itself has 4,300 stars and 210 forks with 44 contributors. So that's a serious open source project. And I think there's a lot of buzz about Rust. Rust has been rapidly rising in popularity. It got the attention because the Linux kernel is starting to integrate Rust code. There was some controversy around that, but I believe that the general consensus is that Rust is the next thing. So it brings the power of C and C++. It has strong memory safety guarantees. And when Stack Overflow did a survey of developers, 72% marked it as the most loved and admired language. I'm also learning Rust. I'm moving some code that I wrote to automate CNC machines over to use Rust for performance reasons. So I'll let you know how that goes. The next story is in the number 3 spot. It's a satirical use of GitHub. I always think GitHub has been the best platform for satire ever made. It's about recall for Linux, and it looks to be a very small repository that's mocking Windows recall. Now, I just want to state for the record, I'm not a Windows user, so I wasn't really familiar with Windows recall, but this repository has an exe file that is not an exe file, so don't worry, you can click on it. It's a script that talks about how Windows recall is sort of a security problem waiting to happen for everybody, and 24/7 screen captures of everything you do. If it's on your screen, we've got you covered. And it's funny, but also for the record, I'm not a Windows user, so I don't fully comprehend it. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention. If you want the link, it's in the show notes. Okay, in the weird bucket for the day's news is this story that's also on Hacker News from Stockholm University, where a bunch of scientists went through old plates for astronomical observations from the 50s, and they found these weird, unexplained flashes of light from objects that should have been in high orbit. And according to this Stockholm University report, which I cannot verify whether Stockholm University is the place to go for this sort of information, but cue the X-Files music, these high orbit light flashes are something we see today from SpaceX satellites and from other satellites in orbit, but they were happening in the 50s. And they also happened the day after atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. So I'm just reporting this in the weird bucket. I'm not commenting on whether it's true or not. It's just one of those fun things you read, and I read it and I get a stomachache because I know it's going to show up on like the Joe Rogan podcast at some point. And he's going to be interviewing some fantastically stupid conspiracy theorists about this being true without it having really being verified or analyzed. Again, so that's today's 3 stories from Hacker News. You can go look at the links in the show notes if you want more information. So the story I wrote last night was about legal issues as they relate to generative AI. And if you want to read the whole story, that link is in the show notes. But what I'm talking about is what happens when generative AI collides with software licenses, terms of service, and the people that make the tools that we rely on. Cursor, Copilot, ChatGPT, these tools can kick out working code very fast, and newer models can reproduce really complex behavior that we used to think of as a product. That puts a lot of pressure on paid software and open source alike. And if an AI can recreate 80% of a tool, why pay? I've asked that question in a couple of my posts. And here's why. I want to make the counter argument. Because if you work somewhere, you've probably already agreed to licenses, end user licensing agreements, terms of service. And I want to make something really clear before we get started. I am not a lawyer. You, as a developer, if you're not a lawyer, you also need to make that your mantra. You need to repeat it to yourself over and over and over again. One of the pieces of advice I give at the end of my piece is don't pretend to be a lawyer. At the same time, I think that developers avoid understanding legal issues. And it's one of the things that I've noticed over the course of my career. A developer will just do something and then they'll circle back and be like, well, it wasn't my job to figure out if I was allowed to do that or not. And that's nonsense. At a prior employer, more than a decade ago, I once worked with somebody who said, well, if I read the end user license agreement, then I'm going to know what I'm doing if I violate it, and it's going to be treble damages. I don't even know if that's a term that's used in the law, but I do know that every time I've told a lawyer that, they laugh and say, no, you can't claim ignorance of an agreement that you agreed to. So I just want everyone listening to this, if you're a developer, the point of my post isn't to say, here's what you can and cannot do with Gen AI. The point of the post is for me to try to encourage you to read these things. Even if you don't fully understand them, read them. And the other piece of advice I'll give you is always talk to your lawyers. If you look at the number of licenses that are involved in any complex software project, you've got a series of open source licenses. And I could write a whole book about how complex those open source licenses can be and how they impact what you can and cannot do. But then you have possibly a series of proprietary licenses that you've agreed to. And some of those proprietary licenses might have clauses in them that would surprise you. They might have clauses in them that are wider than the scope of the application that you're developing. I've heard stories of people getting into agreements with SaaS providers that prohibit them from doing anything within their whole company that might compete with the SaaS provider. I've heard other licenses that have the same clauses, but they're very clear to say, as long as you can demonstrate that that other feature was developed independent of your use of this project, you're fine. What I'll say to you is this: generative AI adds a whole new curve to this, and it's something that you need to be familiar with because it's full of gray areas. And as I write in the post, there's gray areas that a lot of us are walking over every day, maybe without even knowing that we're doing so. One of them is something that I bet a lot of you do if you use Cursor and you switch between models. I've had the experience sometimes where you ask one model to do something, like Sonnet. Say you're asking Sonnet 4 to do something and it takes an hour for it to do something poorly, and you realize, you know what, it's not getting it. I'm going to switch over to Opus. And switching between Sonnet and Opus is fine because you're still using an Anthropic model. But let's say you switch over to Gemini or ChatGPT. Sometimes I've seen people take the entire context from the old conversation and copy it to the new. When you switch a model, Cursor is very explicit. It says, we're not sharing the internal line of reasoning from one model to the other. We are summarizing the conversation and updating the new model with that information. But I have also seen people manually just say, this isn't working. I'm going to copy some of the data that I'm getting from this response over to this new window, and I'm going to use it. Now, that's a gray area. I don't think anyone's going to jail for that or having to pay $1 billion trillion in damages. But it's that sort of thing that is a question. Because if you use any of these models, you have agreed to not use the model or the materials or the output of said model to help train another model. And you can get into a lot of discussions about what does that mean? What does it mean to use output to train? Are you actually using it to train a model? Or does that also cover fine-tuning? Does it cover taking any output from one model and giving it to another and having that model make a conclusion from it? Again, I am not a lawyer, but these are all really interesting things for you to understand as a developer as you start to get into this world. The other thing that I think is very clear to me is that software vendors, people who sell you software, I talk about charting libraries, or it could be anything. More and more, as we see people start to use Gen AI tools, you're going to see these software providers put clauses into their licenses that are really specific about how their software can be used to impact the creation of other software that may or may not compete with the software that they're selling you. And I can't predict how that's going to look. But I think the one thing as a developer that I'm trying to encourage people to do more of is become familiar with the terms of service for the generative AI models you use. Don't just lean back and wait for the lawyers to tell you what to do. I know you work at a place that has lawyers thinking about this right now. And I can tell you something, they're not there every time you have to click on a license agreement or download a new piece of software. But as developers, you also need to start thinking of yourself less as an individual and more as someone who is literally managing a collection of agents that can do the work of 20 in a single day. And if you're going to move into that model as a manager, you need to know about legal issues. You need to know about license issues that might arise. So that's the purpose of the piece I wrote last night. It's a little bit longer than I had intended, but the main point I'm trying to make is become familiar with some of these terms, because I think this is going to start to define the next few years. And the reason why I predict it's going to be active is because all of these companies are going to get to the mode where they have to start thinking defensively. If I download that charting library, am I agreeing to something that puts limitations on what I can do? in other applications. So that's the generative AI article. I wrote it just from my knowledge of the industry and my conversations with other people at the FinOps Foundation conferences. This is something that people are thinking about quite a bit. So once again, I want to thank you for listening. This is the Discursive Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and any platform that you use to listen to podcasts. I would invite you all to subscribe or to like. And if you need to get in contact with me, LinkedIn is probably your best bet at this point. I also want to solicit feedback. If you have any feedback about the format, about the news, about anything you heard today, please go to the show notes and you can find ways to get that feedback to me. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy your day.